Hello, and welcome to Books and Landscape, and I'm Amanda Davey, and for the next number of weeks I'm going to be focusing on themes that have cropped up in my book on the churches of the South Downs National Park called In Their Landscape, because doing 273 churches, chapels and ruined places of worship has thrown up a number of different themes, and it's really interesting to be able to talk about. Today, I'm talking about the themes and connectivity through the South Downs National Park that relate to Jane Austen. When first visiting the churches, we knew that Chawton, the church, was one that Jane and her mother and her sister Cassandra went to, so that was expected, and Alton is known as Austen Country, but it came as rather a surprise to come up against or with a lot of other elements that, or places, names, characters that don't really tend to get much attention. So that's why I'm doing today's video. So through her books, she used a lot of different names that linked to places that she knew and people that she knew or people that she'd come across. And a lot has been written on this. So some of my things I'm doing today are abstract thoughts, not necessarily directly related to what she did, but some may be a bit closer. So, for example, Miss Taylor, who was later Mrs. Weston in Emma, or soon became Mrs. Weston in Emma, there was a very famous character in West Sussex called Sir Charles William Taylor Bart, and he was a close friend of the Prince Regent and part of the Carlton House set, and he owned lands south of Tuxleth Chapel next to Milland Church. Milland is the new name, was the name for the church, but it's quite complicated. And Taylor was from Hollycombe, which was an estate in the woodlands to the north of Lynch. He had built it in 1800 to designs by John Nash, the famous dandy, and he was companion to Prince Regent. Taylor was a name in the area, and of course it's a very common name, but it's interesting that it crops up at Tuxleth and Lynch. Knight, of course, is a family name, and Knightley she puts in, so that's. Then at Warnford we come across the presence of a real Lady Catherine de Bourgh, spelt differently. So the real one was spelt Burgh, not Bourgh, and she was born well after Jane Austen had died. So in 1754, John Smith de Bourgh, 11th Earl of Clanricarde of Ireland, bought the estate. He'd been called Burke until 2 years before, but he wanted to sound more Norman Irish, so changed it to de Bourgh. He called the house Belmont, and embellished it and the park with fashionable features, and turned St. John's House into a scenic ruin. I thought St. John's House was some sort of priory thing or something, but actually it was a family called St. John that owned the area before he built Belmont. He diverted the River Main to create a loop lake with sluices, and Capability Brown is rumoured locally to have been involved, and water management was a feature of his work. Ulick John de Bourgh, who was to inherit West Dean also, was born in 1802, so he was a child in Jane Austen's time, but his father was obviously not. And he became the first Marquis of Glenricard, Postmaster General and Ambassador to Russia. So they were a very high-profile family. Was Lady Catherine named after an earlier Lady Catherine? It's not impossible, but anyway, it's a nice link to have the same name as an interesting fact nugget. Mrs. Smith in Persuasion has links to Sutton and Bignor, because the Reverend Richard Smith, who was the rector of Sutton and Bignor, his aunt was the poet Charlotte Smith, who had grown up at Bignor Park. And Charlotte was very popular in her day and read by Jane Austen. And people think that Mrs. Smith in Persuasion had a very similar life story to that of the unfortunate authoress, and so it's quite a strong and powerful link, that one. But Reverend Smith and the family that Charlotte married into were slave owners, so she was very anti-slavery, very passionately anti-slavery, but she did rely on the slave money for her ability to look after her 12 children. And it wasn't a happy marriage. Then in Alfriston we've got the Henry Smith Charity, which is now a foundation. It was established in 1628 through the legacy of Henry Smith, who was a London businessman, and he dedicated his wealth to support people facing hardship. But at the time of the tithe map, the Henry Smith Charity owned, or was down in the apportionment as owning the land on which the church stood and the field next to it. I think it's amazing to have a really, really high profile charity. It lends out, or gives out, on its website it says 62 million last year was given, and it was founded in 1628. Isn't that one of the best things to do? But was Miss Smith in Emma a charity case a sort of nod at Henry Smith or not? We don't know, but it's interesting to sort of explore ideas, even if they all get rejected. Then at Kilmerston, in 1775, the rector there and at Hinton Ampner was a Reverend Edmund Ferrers, and that ties in with Edward Ferrers in Sense and Sensibility. I think it's Sense and Sensibility. So he was the rector of Cheriton with Kilmerston Chapel later on, from 1780 to 1825. So very much the period that Jane was around. So now we come to her actual life and things that she did. So in Chawton, both her mother and her sister, called Cassandra, were buried to the south of the church, side by side. Jane herself is in Winchester Cathedral. The tithe map was 1838, and Cassandra, Jane's sister, was still living in the house. Reverend Charles Knight was rector there from 1837 to 67, and he was one of her brother Edward's sons. They took the name of Knight. He was also curate of West Weldham and is buried in Chawton churchyard with his aunt and great aunt. Aunt and grandmother, sorry. So just after he started at Chawton, his brother, another Edward Knight, started to go in for the ugly rebuilding scheme of 1838, which involved an ambitious heating scheme that was put in by another in 1871 that led to a fire and destruction of the nave. So the second rebuild was designed by Sir Arthur Blomfield, and the main look of the church is not how it would have looked in Jane's day. Then Tillington, just south of the church, is what was once the rectory, and it's had a few names, starting with Old Rectory, including Lantern House and Ammonia House. And that was built after 1816, when the Reverend James Stanier Clark, friend and librarian to the Prince Regent George, and author of A Life of Nelson, was the rector until his death in 1834. Reverend Clark was the correspondent and tour guide for Jane Austen's visit to Carlton House, and he was the one who arranged for Emma to be dedicated to George IV, which was a very important thing for her in her publishing history. Then we've got Clayton, over not quite East Sussex, not far off, less than a mile into East Sussex. The major landowner of the time of the tithe map was William John Campion, Lord of the Manor of Clayton. He lived at Danny Park in Hurstpierpoint Point, because there was no manor house in Clayton. The one that's called Manor House now was actually a later rectory. Campion was married to another Jane Austen. Her grandfather was the wealthy relative who had educated the famous novelist Jane Austen's father when he was orphaned, and this Jane was her second cousin. And finally, Farringdon. The Reverend John Benn was the rector from 1797 to 1857. His younger sister Mary Harriet was a good friend of Jane's, and she would walk south from Chawton to visit for tea, and Miss Benn was a regular visitor to the Austens at Chawton. So there's a lot more going on. I think that the most unexpected thing is the Tillington connection with the rector and the tour guide for the visit to Carlton House and Emma's dedication. But there's also all the extra things like the names and the people and the de Burghs and the Smiths, and she's woven into the whole area. And of course the tithe map information for the 1830s is only 20 years after she died. So all the things to do with the rectors, the vicars, the curates, they had lives very similar to the lives that she described with Mr. Collins or anything like that. And of course I have omitted to mention Wickham, and that is a medieval town with the church just outside it, and on the tithe map cut out of the town, which is a bit strange. So that the just links galore, and it's a bit of fun. Thank you very much for watching. It would be lovely if you could subscribe. It would be lovely if you could comment, and have a very good rest of your weekend. Thank you.